Um, Welcome everybody to today's history workshop seminar. So today we will be having a seminar by Alessandro De Cola. So I'll start by introducing him, and I'll allow him 20 minutes to give an overview of his paper. Thereafter, we will have a discussion where I'll invite our guests to ask questions or comments. So I'll quickly introduce our speaker. Alessandro De Cola is a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Studies Group, University of Free State. He obtained his PhD in global histories, cultures, and politics at the University of Bologna, Italy in June 2021. His research concentrates on African economic and social history with a special focus on pre-colonial and colonial money. His recent contribution to the edited collection, Monetary Transitions, Currencies, Colonialism, and African Studies, deals with the monetary consequences of the First World War in the Italian colony of Eritrea. He is currently writing his first monograph on the monetary history of the Red Sea during the Italian colonial period. Now I'll hand over to Alessandro, and you can take it away.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank you for allowing me to present this paper in this seminar series. I will share some slides now, and okay, first of all, I want to explain how this the idea for this paper was born. I was actually working on my main project that is about monetary history of the Italian colony of Eritrea, but while working in the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where most of the documents pertaining Italian colonialism are at the moment, I came across this interesting documentation about slavery and slave trade during the Italian colonial period in the Red Sea. So it's a pretty new research that I'm starting right now, and that's also the reason why I will keep this presentation short, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and comments on these. I would like to start from this telegram that I found in the archive of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that was sent by military fiscal lawyer Giovanni Del Corso to the military governor of the Italian colony of Eritrea, Foreste Baratieri, on the 21st of February 1894, which was 4 years after the foundation of the Italian colony of Eritrea and 2 after the ratification of the 1890 Brussels General Act. With this telegram, Giovanni Del Corso convinced General Baratieri to return 2 pearl divers to their nakuda, which is the Arabic word for the captain of the fishing boat, notwithstanding they had declared to be his slaves. So Del Corso's aim was not to spread the news that, and I quote, in Massawa, the indebted crews desert with impunity, end quote. So after I saw this telegram, I wanted to understand why an officer of the Italian colonial government was suggesting his governor to act against the international regulations on slave trade that they had signed a few years before. And so this paper is my first attempt at analyzing the transformations of labor relations in colonial Eritrea by looking at the persistence of debt labor and slavery labor regimes during the Italian colonial period. This presentation shows how the international and bilateral agreements against slave trade and exploitation were circumvented in order to support the colonial economic project. In particular, it focuses on the persistence of labor relationships comparable to slavery on pearl and mother-of-pearl fishing boats in the territorial waters of the Italian colony of Eritrea. So with this paper, I also wish to add to the scant literature on slavery and the slave trade in the Red Sea in the 19th and 20th century, Compared to the more studied Atlantic trade, the Red Sea trade in human beings cannot be easily quantified due to the more informal nature of the trade and the absence of ship manifests. Some attempts at quantifying this trade have been made by Paul Lovejoy and Ralph Austin, while the first studies focusing on the peculiarities of slavery and slave trade in the region are Richard Bunker's ones, even though mainly looking at Ethiopia. More recently, Jonathan Meeran has analyzed manumission certificates issued under the Egyptian rule in Massawa, while Stephen Searles historicized some contemporary forms of human trafficking and slavery in the southern Red Sea region by looking at the failure of colonial anti-slavery initiatives. Despite these remarkable works, a lot still awaits to be done, especially given the availability of colonial documentation that still awaits to be fully explored, as Jonathan Meeran recently pointed out in his contribution on the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History. The documents I'm presenting here give just a glimpse of the potential of the sources held at the archive of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Italy arrived quite late in Africa compared to other imperialistic European powers, but as a recently born nation, the Italian government were eager to affirm the country as an international power. And in order to do so, since the 80s, Italian governments exploited their diplomatic channels to secure an access to Africa and take part in the Berlin Conference in 1884. With the British approval and logistical support, they occupied Massawa in 1885, taking over the Egyptian administration at the end of that year. And as a consequence, they also replaced the Egyptian in the 1877 Anglo-Egyptian Anti-Slavery Convention, providing both parties the rights to search and seize of ships which were suspected to be involved in the trade. The ratification of the General Acts of Brussels in 1882 was an important step for the anti-slavery action, as it was the first multilateral agreement on this matter, allowing all signatory powers the right of search and seizure of each other's ships. So in order to carry out the surveillance activity required by the Act, Italy created a squadron of Navy dogs to be employed in the Red Sea. And these are two of the Navy dogs of the Italian Navy. And the locally manufactured dogs were more apt to navigate the shallow and tricky waters of the Red Sea, but insufficient to patrol the 2,000 kilometers coast of the colony. From 1903 to 1913, only 394 manumission certificates were issued, and most of the time the individuals who autonomously, most of the time they were issued to individuals that autonomously passed the border in order to get them. The few times manumission certificates were issued after an operation at sea show that probably those numbers represent only the tip of the iceberg. In 1909, for example, only 30 certificates were issued, and 20 of these 30 certificates were for sailors and divers working on two those seized by the Italian Navy at the end of that year. A look at the origins of the divers also shows the extent of the trade networks which crossed the Red Sea, with Omanite boats whose crews were made up of individuals coming from as far as Zanzibar and Baluchistan. Pearl and mother of pearls, fishing and trading in Massawa is documented since the 15th century, and the industry was still one of the most lucrative at the end of the 19th century. The pearl fishing season occurred in two different periods, from the beginning of March to the end of May, and from September to December, when around 300 fishing boats used to reach the Eritrean territorial waters, even from the Persian Gulf. Usually, the investors of pearl and mother of pearls fishing expeditions were representatives of Gujarati firms, generally called Banians, or also rich merchants from Massawa or the Dalak archipelago, right in front of the town of Massawa, who were also the owners of the boats. They used to anticipate enough funds for the subsistence of the crew during the whole season, and sometimes also for the sailors and divers' families. On the one hand, the anticipations secured the investors the right of preemption to buy the products of the expeditions. On the other, this created the conditions for the debt slavery status, tying the crew to the nakuda and to the boat. Divers and sailors did not get a regular salary, but a share on the earnings from the selling of the pearls and mother of pearl, after both the ship owner and the nakoda withheld their shares. And with the same amount of money, any debt toward the nakoda had also to be repaid. For this reason, the bargaining power of the crew was very low, and their season could often be unprofitable. Another model for the distribution of the shares was the division of the working week in 5 days. The products of the first 4 days were for the nakoda, his second in command, the owner of the boat, and other investors, and the ones of the last days had to be shared by the whole crew. It's easy to see how this could be even riskier for the crew, as the 5th day could have been a bad day compared to the other 4 days of work. During the interrogations to colonial officers conducted in order to issue the manumission papers, some divers declared that they used to earn around 15 to 20 rupees per year, and that their last owner had bought them for 100 or 200 rupees around the beginning of the 20th century. In some cases, the owner was not the nakoda, but other individuals participating in the fishing expedition by borrowing their slaves to the nakoda. Moreover, it should be underlined that apart from the meager income of the divers, the job itself was extremely demanding, exposing the divers to different kinds of injuries and accidents, like the perforation of eardrums and decompression syndromes. This labor regime, where a form of debt slavery was ongoing even on those boats that were registered in the Eritrean colony and therefore could have not exploited slaves on the boats, was defined as a disguised form of slavery by the Italian journalist Renato Paoli in 1913. The mix of high profits and cheap labor soon attracted Italian speculators, advancing many offers to the colonial government, seeking to get exclusive rights on the fishing and trading of pearl and mother of pearls. At first, the Italian military administration turned down all the offers, as the military governors did not want to upset the delicate commercial environment of Massawa. It was the first civilian governor of the colony of Eritrea, Ferdinando Martini, to issue the first concession to the Società Perlifera Italiana in 1898, which in exchange of a yearly payment of 30,000 lire, Italian lire, could claim up to 35% of the earnings of the fishing doors. At the same time, it pledged to invest these sums in the preservation and enhancement of pearl banks in the territorial water of the colony. But given that these aims were never met and that the concession proved the partial diversion of the fishing boats towards other ports of the Red Sea, the concession was amended in 1904. From then on, a new agreement was signed with the Del Mar Company, which was involved in pearl trading since the arrival of the Italians in Massawa in 1885. And the new agreement was defined, and I quote, irrational exploitation of this precious resource of the colony, end quote. In fact, the only task of the company was that of registering the members of the fishing boats, getting 12 Maria Theresa thalers per each members. And this activity could have turned it useful for the anti-slavery actions. Instead, this fact gives us another opportunity to question the real intentions of the colonial government of actively interfering with the slave trading and exploitation in the Red Sea. On 8th of January 1911, the Secretary General of the Italian Anti-Slavery Society wrote a letter to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs asking that the Del Mar Company pledge to assess the state of freedom of the divers and sailors during its registration activity. Governor of Eritrea Giuseppe Salvagoraggi swiftly refused, declaring that it would have not been possible to ask the Del Mar Company to conduct an activity that was not included in the original agreement. In order to have a glimpse of the conflicting interests revolving around pearl fishing and anti-slavery action in the Italian colony of Eritrea, I will now describe a specific case from February 1912. The case is about the seizure of the Sambuk, which is a bigger doe, and actually the one we can see in this picture, that was called Fat al-Khair, the liberation of 3 pearl divers, and accusation of the 60-year-old Nakoda Arp Benard from Dubai, together with 3 of his associates, of slavery and assault. This case is particularly interesting because the proceedings of the trial allow a multilateral perspective on the events, highlighting the points of view of the officers, the soldiers, the merchants, the judges, the colonial administrators, and especially the Nakoda and the divers. So at the beginning of February 1912, the Nakoda had reached the island of Nokra in the Dahlak archipelago that is here right in front of Massawa. To get the necessary fishing and then moved to Massawa to get the necessary fishing permits. And while he was in Massawa, two divers from his fishing boat called Zadallah and Farajala Mahmed escaped its boat, and one of them reached one of the Italian army doors, declaring to be Art Ben-Ab's slave. He then was conducted to Massawa, where he was questioned and where he also declared that other 15 slaves like him were still on the Feit al-Khair. For this reason, the authorities issued a manumission certificate to Farajallah, found Art Ben-Arp, arrested him in order to prosecute him. Art Ben-Arp was then bailed by a rich merchant from Massawa called Said Mohammed Omar el-Safi, while his boat was brought in the harbor of Massawa in order to investigate on Farajallah's statements. In that occasion, another diver, Recep Chamhan Said, drew the harbor guard's attention while attempting to escape the boat and declared to be Art Ben-Ab's slave too. Art Ben-Arp and his associates were then prosecuted for both these events. The whole indictment was built upon the Article 337 of the Italian Merchant Shipping Code, stating that to treat a slave as such on a ship comes under the trafficking offense. In fact, the Brussels Act did not include any system of sanctions, for which instead the laws of the different jurisdictions were applied. Given that the Italian system was not properly equipped to deal with slavery and slave trade, the judges produced a more complex definition of slavery, which is very adequate to describe the labor conditions of pearl divers. And I quote, is a sequence of coercive actions clearly aiming at subjugating someone in order to exploit their job, end quote. The strength of this definition lies in that it avoids to employ any generic concepts of property, focusing instead on the kind of rights exerted on someone, and in particular on their labor. Nevertheless, the judges acquitted all the defendants from all the charges on the 14th of May. First of all, because according to the judges, Ben-Arp was a pearl merchant and not a slave trader. In fact, he had just bought slaves in the past, but never sold them. Secondly, the slaves found on the boat were considered domestic slaves, according to the definition that was tolerated by Article 62 of Brussels Act. According to the judges, domestic slavery was, and I quote, necessary for those societies that are still backwards on the path to civilization, end quote. Thirdly, there were not enough irons on the boat to support the slave trade accusation. Finally, all the allegations of assault were also dropped because according to the judges, they were justified by the irresponsible behavior of the slave who did not have a notion of the rights and duties of a free man and tended to exaggerate his statements. In fact, the freedom certificates were not retrieved, thus recognizing the slave conditions of the pearl divers, but no one was punished for their exploitation and mistreatment. This particular case, however, had also another interesting implication. On the 6th of June 1912, in a letter to the Civil Affairs Office of the colony, Art Ben-Arp's lawyer in the trial, Carlo Matteoda, accused the harbor masters, Enrico Macchia, of abuse of power in the Arp case, for having arrested him in the absence of enough evidence. Interestingly, Carlo Matteoda was also the Del Mar concessionaire company's legal advisor. In his letter, Carlo Matteoda, like Giovanni Del Corso about 20 years before, expressed the concerns that the harbor master's behavior could damage the pearl and mother of pearl industry in the territorial waters of the colony. I conclude here. This paper offers just a glimpse of the potentialities of documents produced by the Italian colonial administration in fulfillment of the anti-slavery activity for the study of labor conditions, origins, and also some bits of the biographies of the enslaved people working on the fishing boats in the Red Sea. At the same time, they highlight the conflicts permeating the Eritrean colonial society, divided between the need to comply with international and bilateral agreements and the private interests of the capital, overcoming any rational or national interest. Notwithstanding the criminal nature sanctioned by international regulations of the labor relationship bonding the pearl divers to the Nakoda, loopholes and technicalities were willingly exploited in order to tolerate it and support the colonial economic project. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you, Alessandro, for that interesting overview of your paper. So now we will move on to the second part of our seminar. We'll allow the I'll open the floor to the audience to if they have any questions or comments. You can either raise your hand or type it in the comment box, then I will just read it out loud. So any questions or comments, you can go ahead and raise it. So while the audience, oh, okay, I see a hand. Karen, you can go ahead. Just please introduce yourself before asking your question or comment. Karen, you can go ahead.
Hi everyone. Karen, I'm the managing editor of the Global Labor Journal. I have a question emanating from the first page of your paper, where you have a paragraph about how the notion of slavery has been dealt with in the literature, and you indicate that in most cases slavery has been equated with chattel slavery. But it seems to me that the sort of thing that you're talking about in your presentation and in the paper is a different creature. You talk about, for instance, debts that the pearl divers owed to the Nakodas and others in that chain. So if it's a case of chattel slavery, then you know the owner owns the slave outright, and there's no question of any debt. You know, everything that that the slave does belongs to the owner. But if, for instance, you're talking about indentured labor, then there is an issue of debt, because maybe the person who hired or owns the indentured laborer might have paid for their passage or something. So there I can see debt. So how are you defining slavery in your research and in this paper? I'm trying to get a better grip of the whole notion of slavery and how it's been treated. Thank you.
Thank you. May I reply now to this question?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carly, for this question, which is actually extremely interesting to me, because it's basically one of the main reasons why I wanted to write this paper, to reflect on the different forms of slavery that could be found in different areas in Africa and in the Indian Ocean world, for example. And what I meant to say in my paper, and which I need to specify better, is that when these agreements and regulations were discussed in the 1890 or even other previous regulations, there was a strong campaign in Europe, anti-slavery campaign, that was mostly based on what slavery had been in the plantation system in the US. And that's why I was comparing these definitions to that of chattel slavery, while this case that I'm describing here is obviously not the case, because it's more similar maybe to a form of indentured labor, And definitely I would prefer calling it like a debt slavery. And that is my point, is that maybe that is also the reason why these agreements could not actually be effective against these forms of debt slavery, because they were produced having in mind another kind of slavery, which is chattel slavery. And this also allowed some colonial administrators to play with these definitions in order to decide when was the case to be more active against slave trade and slavery in their jurisdiction, and when rather decide to close maybe one eye or even both the eyes to let this kind of labor relationships go in order not to hamper local economy. So I don't know if I was able to explain the reason why I was making that comparison, but I should definitely explicitate that better in the paper. So thank you for your question and your comment.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 questions in the chat box. I'll just read it out for you. Njongu asked, can you say a bit about the extent of the resources in the sea, as well as where demand came from, local or international? The second question from Emmanuel, Abraham Lincoln outlawed slavery in 1863, and the 1819 Brussels Act came later. Was the Brussels Act derived from the Lincoln Proclamation? And the last question from Ali, can you comment further about the archive? How widely known is its existence in the former colony? So you can go ahead and answer those questions.
Thank you. So I will start from the first question. Yes, the resource at sea, the pearl and mother of pearls were probably the most important resource of the port of Massawa, even before the Eritrean colony, actually. And we can have evidence of this also from the documents that are held in Trieste, which was former, which was basically the most important port town of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the end of the First World War. Trieste was basically the main the main port for the imports of mother of pearl, and from Trieste then mother of pearl was distributed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So even before the arrival of the Italians in 1885 in Massawa, mother of pearl was already a huge resource that was traveling to Europe. And another evidence of this is the spreading of the Maria Teresa thaler in the Red Sea area, which was this silver coin that became the most widespread silver coin in the Red Sea region, basically until the 50s of the 20th century. And the Maria Teresa thaler was produced by the mint in Vienna, and was used by merchants from Trieste to buy mainly coffee and also mother of pearl. And that is also the reason why it was widespread in the region. Talking about pearls, there were 2 different channels, basically. One was London and Paris, and this was mainly related to white pearls. And then there was also a very important commercial network connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean and India in particular, where darker pearls were more in demand. So these were the 2 main channels for the trade of pearls coming from the Red Sea. I must also say that the Red Sea, the pearl coming from the Red Sea were not the Red Sea was not the place from where most of the pearls were coming. Most of the pearls were coming. 80% of the traffic was coming actually from the Persian Gulf. and the Red Sea was one of the probably most important basin after the Persian Gulf for mother of pearls and pearls. For the second question, Emmanuel question, yes, as I said already in the first answer, these regulations were strongly pushed by anti-slavery movements that were widespread in Europe, and that were partly based on what was happening in America. At the same time, another important push to the development of these agreements was the campaign by Cardinal Lavigérie that was trying to protect the actions of Catholic missions in Africa that were trying to direct part of the youths that were, according to them, saved from slavery into the Catholic mission system, basically. So Cardinal Lavigérie was also lobbying in Europe, trying to convince European powers to start a crusade in Africa in order to hamper the slave trade. What I wanted to say in the first question is that, also in the first question, in the first answer, is that plantation system in America was certainly one of the most powerful drive for the construction of these regulations like the Brussels Act. But at the same time, the reality that was on the ground showed that one definition of slavery was basically not enough. So these kind of agreements were certainly based on the events in the US, but at the same time, they were applied in a different fashion in different areas of the African continent, simply because the definition of slavery they were addressing was not the one that was actually on the ground in each and every part of the African continent. I will move now to the third question. Yeah, about the archive. Okay, so these documents I was using for this paper are actually fresh from the archive. All of them come from the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the reason is that the story of the Italian colonial documents is a peculiar one, because most of the Italian documents were brought from Eritrea to Italy in the 50s. So after the end of the Second World War, there was an agreement with the British military administration that allowed the Italians to export the documents of the former administration from Eritrea to Italy. I'm actually currently studying this story because it's quite interesting, and it's also quite unique, I may say, because it's also for current international regulations. It's actually not really allowed to take the documentation from one country to another after the other country has lost its jurisdiction on that country. So that story is a very interesting story. There are still documents in the former colony in Eritrea. Some of them have not been cataloged yet, and Eritrea is also quite a different environment to where to go and research this kind of documents, where also because the state the Eritrean government has quite a powerful office that is in charge for the collection of these documents, for the cataloging of these kind of documents, and it's something that is still in progress now. I'm quite, of course, this office, the government office for the government documentation office of Eritrea is aware of the documents that are in Italy. I don't know if they are aware of these particular documents on slavery, also because they are quite understudied, and this is also the reason why I really wanted to write a paper on these cases. But there are some collaboration, some form of collaboration ongoing between some Italian universities and this Eritrean institution working on the collection of colonial and post-colonial documents in Eritrea. It's still there's still a long way to go before this kind of exchange are actually also useful for Eritrean researchers, for example, because I really think that a digitization process, for example, should be started as soon as possible. There are actually some processes of digitization of some of the documents that are now present in Eritrea. But of course, it's not easy for Eritrean researchers to reach Italy and study these documents in the Italian archives. So yeah, hopefully that would be possible one day. Thank you. I hope that I managed to reply to all of your questions.
Thank you, Alessandro. If there are any other questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat box. Meanwhile, while people get their thoughts together, I just wanted to ask myself. You mentioned in your case study, you sort of mentioned how the colonial judges had sort of a paternalistic approach to slavery. I was just wondering, could you say more about that? Like, why did they have that sort of attitude, especially when they were also in support of the act?
Yes, thank you. This is actually an aspect that I wish to analyze more in the future, because reading the documents of the court records regarding slavery and the manumission paper, for example, one of the justifications that are used by the colonial administrators and the judges also in order not to punish the perpetrators is that basically, according to them, someone that has been enslaved does not have basically the ability to look after himself independently from the owner. So this is the kind of paternalistic approach that I could find in basically all the documents that I analyzed. There's always the need to comply with international regulation, but at the same time, there's always an administrator, or also in this case, for example, the lawyer saying, stating that by freeing an enslaved individual, they are not doing him a favor, because this enslaved individual is not capable to look after himself without the owner basically providing for him. So on the one hand, this was an attitude that was quite widespread in Europe at the time, but at the same time, it's interesting the way colonial administrators were using this paternalistic approach in order to also protect the one that were exploiting the slaves, by saying that it was almost a humanitarian, by saying that this kind of exploitation was almost a humanitarian act toward the slaves that were working for the owner that was looking after them and providing for them and keeping them on his boat and providing for their family, for example. So this is the kind of paternalistic approach I could read in the documentation.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any other hands or comments in the chat box. Let me just have a look in the chat box. Okay, there's one question in the chat box from Karen. Does this assumption that slaves couldn't look after themselves mean that there was no mechanism for freelance divers?
Thank you for this question, Karen. This is actually a very interesting question. Actually, from what I saw in the documents, not at that moment. So not in the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Because traditionally that kind of industry was organized in that way. Basically, you needed someone that owned a boat, and this person owning one boat or more boats needed someone to manage the boat and the captains, and then the divers were almost all organized in that way. So even if they were not officially slaves, there was that kind of organization of debt slavery that looked like debt slavery. So this system of anticipations that were basically tying the crew to the nagoda and to the boat. Another reason is probably also because it was an extremely difficult job. Actually, I could find in the document some requests from some Italian subjects from Italy, asking the Italian government in Eritrea to come to Eritrea and basically get into the pearl business. So people from southern Italy, fishermen from southern Italy that wanted to engage with the fishing of pearls and mother of pearl in Massawa. Some of them managed to come to Massawa and start the business, but quite soon they decided to go back to Italy for two reasons. First, because it was an extremely difficult environment and an extremely difficult job, and also because there was a really difficult competition. The nagodas and the owners of the boats were extremely jealous of the pearl banks, and they were the only one to know where exactly the pearls were in the area, and it was extremely difficult to get this kind of information. There are also some cases where some slaves or some pearl divers decided to escape the boat and engage by themselves, organize themselves and engage in the fishing of the birds autonomously. But the problem was then that it was extremely difficult for them to sell the products their products on the market, because first of all, most of the time they were fugitives. They were basically escaping from the fishing boats, so they could not sell by themselves. They had to use some intermediaries, and for that same reason, they could not sell at the market price. They had to undersell their products because they needed to get rid as soon as possible of the product of their fishing activity, because basically they were not authorized to fish by themselves. There were also some mechanism of bonding, ritual bonding to the nagoda enforced on the boats. There were some sort of prayers and rituals that were raised by the slaves and the divers and the sailors, that were basically swearing to the nagoda that they would not steal the product of the fishing season, and so for this reason they these independent divers were heavily sanctioned by society and the market itself. So it was extremely difficult for them to be like freelance divers.
Thank you for that. So perhaps I'll give you a chance to give your concluding remarks, final remarks, and then we can end off the session.
Okay, thank you. Again, first of all, I want to thank you for allowing me to present this paper, which, as I said, is a very early stage paper, and it's also a new field of research for me. So your comments have been extremely useful for me in order to improve the quality of this paper. I really think there's plenty of opportunities using these documents to add an important part of African history to the history of slavery and labor relations, especially because that area, the northeastern area of Africa, sometimes is really understudied, and also in a comparative perspective, it would be extremely interesting to see what kind of information these documents can still bring out. So I really thank you for the interest that you showed on this topic, and for being here listening to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. It's a pleasure having you here today, and thank you again. Okay, then that should